Ever walk into a room and just feel like something's off? Like you can't put your finger on it, but
Yeah.
the vibe is just weird.
Oh, totally. It's like our brains are wired to pick up on those subtle cues,
Yeah.
even when we don't realize it.
Right. And that's what's so cool about observation as a research method. It's about going beyond just seeing and really truly observing what's going on. And for this deep dive, we're diving into the work of Dr. Philip Adu. He's kind of a big deal in the world of qualitative research.
Huge. I mean, he's got a PhD. He founded the Center for Research Methods. He literally wrote the book on qualitative data coding.
Seriously. So we're in good hands. And his work on developing a researcher mindset, especially when it comes to observation, that's what we're really geeking out about today.
What I find so fascinating about Adu's take is this. He's all about understanding the context of what you're observing. Like, it's not enough to just notice something. You have to understand the why behind it.
It's so true. One of my biggest takeaways from his notes was how often I jump to conclusions without the full picture. You think you're being observant, but really you're just filling in the blanks with your own assumptions.
All the time.
But Adu gives us this framework, right? He lists 6 main things we can observe: people, places, activities, behaviors, events, and even whole situations.
6. It's broader than you might think.
Way broader. I mean, I was picturing like just watching people's faces, but this is next level observation. And the thing that really stood out to me, he says that observing behaviors can be one of the richest sources of insight.
Which makes sense. Our actions speak louder than words and all that.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly complex because how we interpret someone's behavior, that's filtered through our own experiences and biases, right?
Totally. Which we'll get into more in a bit. But first, I want to talk about how Dr. Adu breaks down the actual process of observation. He gives you these super practical questions to ask yourself before you even start.
He does. It's like he's handing you this toolkit. Things like, how often does a behavior occur? How long does it last? Does it change depending on the time of day, the people involved, even the physical location?
It blew my mind. Like, these are such simple questions, but I realized I never actually stopped to think about them.
Most people don't. But by asking them, Adu argues, you're basically turning on your detective vision, noticing details that other people might miss entirely.
Love that detective vision. And he also talks about the importance of deciding what your role as an observer is going to be. Are you trying to blend in, be a fly on the wall, or are you going to be a more active participant in the situation?
Which is huge EE, because your very presence as an observer can actually change the behavior you're trying to observe. It's like that whole "a watch pot never boils" thing.
Ah, so true. It's like when you know your boss is watching you work, you act totally different, right?
Exactly. Adu's work really forces you to think about yourself as an instrument of observation and to be aware of your own presence and potential influence. And it goes even deeper than that. He also talks about understanding your observer lens.
Yes. This was huge for me. It's like we all have our own unique set of experiences, our own values and beliefs, right? So it's impossible to be completely neutral when we're observing something.
Of course, we're not robots after all.
Yeah.
But those preconceived notions, those biases we carry with us, they can shape what we see and how we interpret it, often without us even realizing it.
It's like this one time I got an email from my boss and I totally freaked out.
Oh no, what happened?
It was about this project I was working on, and her tone just seemed so off, like really short, kind of blunt.
So you thought you were in trouble.
100%. I was convinced I was about to get fired, but then I found out later she'd been up all night working on this huge presentation. She was totally exhausted.
And it just came out in her writing.
Exactly. If I had just stopped for a second and considered the context, instead of letting my own insecurities run wild.
It's so easy to do, though. We all project our own stuff onto other people's behavior, especially when we're stressed or anxious.
For real. And it's like Dr. Adu is saying you can't separate the observer from the observation. Speaking of, there's this other part in his notes where he talks about the difference between what we see and what we think or feel about it.
Oh, that's a big one. He actually uses a great example. Imagine you're observing kids in a classroom, right? You could simply note objectively how many times a child raises their hand. Or you could write down that the child seems eager to participate.
Subtle difference, but it changes everything.
Totally. One is just data, what you're actually seeing. The other is your interpretation of that data.
And both are valuable, right? But it's being aware of the difference.
Exactly. Adu's not saying you should only be objective or only be subjective. It's about being conscious of that shift and acknowledging that both are happening, because that's where biases creep in.
Okay, so then how do we get better at spotting those biases? Because it feels kind of impossible, like they're so ingrained, so subconscious.
It definitely takes practice. But Adu's work gives us some good tools. He's big on this idea of what he calls checking your biases throughout the observation process.
Checking your biases. Okay, so how do we actually do that?
Well, a good place to start is just becoming aware of some common biases that trip people up. Have you ever heard of confirmation bias?
Maybe. It sounds familiar, but remind me.
Basically, it's this tendency we all have to gravitate towards information that confirms what we already believe, even if that information is totally wrong or misleading.
Oh, like when you're obsessed with a certain brand of coffee, so you only read the positive reviews online and ignore anything negative? Oof. Yeah, I've totally been there. But okay, this has been seriously eye-opening stuff, but let's bring it back down to earth for a sec. For our listeners out there, what does all of this actually mean for them? Like, how can we use Dr. Adu's insights in our own lives, even if we're not, professional researchers?
That's the beauty of it, though. You don't have to be a researcher to benefit from Adu's work. Take, like, your next team meeting at work.
Okay.
What if you went into that meeting, but you were observing those interactions with the same kind of intentionality that Adu's talking about?
Ooh, I like where you're going with this.
Right. Like, instead of just sitting there, half listening, you're actually paying attention to how people are communicating. Who's dominating the conversation? Who's holding back? Any little nonverbal, body language that might be saying way more than their words are.
Whoa, you'd pick up on so much stuff. It'd be like having a superpower.
Exactly. Or even think about your personal relationships. Let's say you're having a conversation with your partner, your best friend, whoever, and you just get that feeling that something's off.
Happens all the time.
Instead of immediately jumping to conclusions, try using Adu's framework. What specific behaviors are you noticing? What's the context of this interaction? And maybe the most important one, are you letting your own assumptions or insecurities color how you're interpreting things?
Mind blown. It's like Adu's giving us this whole new way to navigate our relationships.
100%. And even beyond our personal interactions, think about how much information we're bombarded with every single day. News, social media, historical accounts.
It's overwhelming if you think about it.
Totally. And Adu's work is this great reminder that there's always a lens, a perspective shaping that information, whether it's intentional or not.
It's like they say there are three sides to every story. Yours, mine, and the truth.
And sometimes the truth is somewhere in the middle. But by being more aware of our own biases and the biases of the people around us and the sources we trust.
We become way more discerning.
Exactly. More critical thinkers, less likely to be swayed by misinformation or manipulation. And I think ultimately that's what Adu's work is all about.
It's not just about seeing, it's about understanding. It's about asking the right questions. And maybe most importantly, it's about becoming more aware, not just of the world around us, but of ourselves, too.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. For anyone listening who wants to go even deeper on this stuff, and trust me, you do definitely check out Dr. Adu's website. It's centerforresearchmethods.com.
And his book, A Step-by-Step Guide to Qualitative Data Coding. It's a must-read for anyone serious about this stuff.
So good. We'll link to both in the show notes. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, everyone happy observing.